Hello, and welcome to Unitary Designation. Today, I wanted to talk about one of my favorite things in the whole wide world: coffee. Now, I'm a huge fan of coffee. I'm also a huge fan of philosophy and, just good things in general. I'm I'm fascinated by coffee's effect on knowledge work and how the quality of the bean correlates to the not just the quality of the taste, but the quality of the stimulant effect. Like the ideas. I have a theory, and it's not backed up by any evidence, so disregard this as like a working hypothesis. But because coffee is a plant, it's a bean technically, or I guess it's a seed. I actually don't know, but it's from plants. It doesn't come out of animals, and so it has natural defense mechanisms, like all things, like all plants do. Because if plants didn't have any form of defensive mechanisms, then well, we could just always eat all plants, and then no plants would be here because we'd eat them all. So plants have some form of like natural defensive structure. And if you don't believe this, just go out, buy 40 buy 40 kilos of lettuce and eat nothing but lettuce for like 3 days straight and see if you still want to eat lettuce. Or takes another example, like sunflower seeds. Go out, buy a box of sunflower seeds, eat the whole box, and then see if you still want more seeds. Something in your body is like, okay, enough of that seed. So you have some form of like, plants have a way to not be eaten too much. Enough to pass around the seeds, not enough to die. It's been an evolutionary arms race between plants and biological beings. So why did I tell you all that? Well, it has to do with the reason why some forms of coffee produce different ideas than others. Some forms of beans, if they're grown in bad environments with a lot of pesticides, with a lot of I don't know what causes some coffees to be superior to others or inferior to others, but they certainly are. So the coffee I'm drinking now is very, very good. It was very expensive, but it's very good. It's from a Norwegian brewery. Yeah. Well, they don't brew it; they burn it. It's from a Norwegian roast house called Tim Vendelbo. It's delicious. It's delicious, and it's the good stuff, and it produces all kinds of like intellectual stimulation that first price filter coffee just does not produce. And in my head, I'm thinking it has something to do with the amount of inflammation it causes in the body. That's my working hypothesis. I could be way off. That could be total BS. Whatever. It's just an interesting thought I have. Because inflammation in the body is one way to regulate how much of a thing that you can have. So I love coffee. I love it. It creates interesting ideas, and it's just the best. Coffee is just the best. And it got me thinking, what has philosophers said about coffee? Because, it's a relatively recent European introduction to European society. I think, I don't actually know this, but I don't think you can trace mass coffee use. Wasn't there a hypothesis that the Enlightenment, or at least the sort of post-Enlightenment, like the move in Europe from like beer to coffee as a main beverage of consumption daily, changed us from the Dark Ages to Enlightenment period. Now, causation, correlation, irrelevance, the two periods overlap. That's and coffee houses in England were even banned by the king because people would like get together and talk about ideas in stimulated environments. So I love coffee. And in my earlier video, I talked about how philosophers were sleeping on VR, the implications of virtual worlds. But philosophers might even be sleeping on coffee. Like we might be that far behind intellectually. I don't know. I haven't read any. Maybe there's a lot of great philosophical and scientific articles on caffeine. But one philosopher that I know about talked about coffee, and I've brought up the quote here. I'm gonna share it now. One of my favorite philosophers, Albert Camus, not Camus or Camus or should I kill myself or have a cup of coffee? That's just such a great. The quote goes on, but in the end, one needs more courage to live than to kill himself, and that's true. It's very courageous to live. It's very cowardly to die, but suicide, obviously. But that question, should I kill myself or should I have a cup of coffee? I don't know if it's just me, but I relate to that. Like when I wake up in the morning, I'm like, oh, okay, coffee, and then the rest of the day follows. So I don't know if that says more about me or about coffee. Now, to put that in context, Camus was an existential philosopher. He talked about the myth of Sisyphus, the man condemned to push the stone up the mountain for infinity. It's a Greek myth. And so Camus, as an existential philosopher, it's interesting. He also talks about football. And he's the only philosopher I've ever found that actually addresses what football is and what coffee is. So, or at least, only philosopher I've found who talks about what coffee is. So, I love coffee. I love cafes, and all the other existentialists, Sartre and Du Bois, all the French existentialists, they all hung around in coffee shops. A lot. Like, they all hung around in cafes and drank coffee, and, I think Sartre took so much stimulants and caffeine that he blew out the blood pressure, that he lost his vision. I think that's accurate. I don't know, but I seem to remember reading that. And it got me thinking, is there some subsection of humanity, obviously we all like coffee, but is there some subsection of humanity that, what's the correlation between existential, thoughts about existence per se, and the central nervous system stimulation brought about by caffeine? Is there a correlation? And if there is, what is it? And if there's not, why did the French intellectuals, the French existential philosophers, draw themselves to those kinds of substances? It might just be nothing, but I love existentialism and I love coffee, and I do feel like there's a correlation. I do, yeah. I'm definitely better on coffee. I'm happier. It's a drug. It's totally a drug. I'm high right now on coffee. I've had nothing but coffee, and you can just tell, my moods, my energy, just everything seems so good and hopeful and fun, and I don't know if coffee has that effect on everyone, but for me it's definitely a mood regulator. And I don't know what to make of that, because I lived most of my life without coffee. I didn't have coffee until I was 25. And then when I found coffee, when I had it, and I was like, this is real. I was like, I found something that I understand why coffee became such a big part of our culture. Terence McKenna. Let me find him for you. I have the loudest keyboard in the history of existence, by the way. Here we go. This is a public intellectual / there's no way to really tell what McKenna was. Let's see what Wikipedia has to say. He was an American ethnobotanist and mystic. Oh, they have him as a mystic. That's impressive. I wouldn't have put him as a mystic. I would have put him as an intellectual. Yeah. You can tell by this laundry list of things he talked about that he he had an insane openness to ideas, like actually out of the charts openness to ideas. He spoke and wrote about a variety of subjects, including psychedelic drugs, plant-based entheogens, shamanism, metaphysics, alchemy, language, philosophy, culture, technology, environmentalism, and consciousness. Is like my kind of guy. And yeah, he used to say that the West had their drugs. They had red meat, they had sugar, they had caffeine, and they had what's the fourth? Oh, well, he listed off that each culture is defined by by the sanctioned drugs that they use. Like you could say China has tea, and that certain like the ethnobotanism that he practiced, the anthropology, like the old school tribes had their drugs that they considered canon for their society: harmine, mescaline, ayahuasca, all these different plant-based entheogens. And he made the case that the West is no different. We just have different drugs that are canonical. So he listed, red meat, which I don't know if red meat is considered a drug, but if you eat nothing but red meat for like a week, you definitely get some form of like, you get a state of being that is very different from if you eat just plants for a week or 2 weeks. 2 weeks of red meat, 3 weeks of red meat, you'll feel very different than if you ate plants for 3 weeks. Coffee, definitely a drug, definitely a drug. Tobacco was the fourth one. So red meat, sugar, caffeine, and tobacco. Those were like the canonical drugs of the West. And they're great for productivity and engagement and mood, apparently. I just love coffee. I think McKenna meant that as a critique, but that's interesting. I don't know if you could... Just because you identify the canonical drugs of the West, assuming he did, I mean, you could argue that our canonical drugs are antidepressants and cocaine and marijuana and... Well, I do believe... Think about it. Think about sugar and caffeine. Both are white powders in their refined form. You might think that caffeine is black, but if you filter out caffeine from the coffee beans, it's just a white powder, like sugar. Anything you distill to that degree is just going to be white powder, because they haven't... The chemical hasn't evolved a need for reflecting light in any way. Because it's just... yeah, the part of the coffee bean that becomes black, like there's more inside a coffee bean than just caffeine. It's not just a capsule for white powder. There's a lot of stuff in there, a lot of different. God, I wish I knew my coffee theory. But there's more to coffee than caffeine. If you've ever taken a caffeine pill, you'll know it's related but not identical to the coffee experience. So just because you identify the canonical drug of a culture, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a critique. It might sound like it, because it sort of sounds like a put down, like, oh, the West is defined by caffeine and red meat and sugar and tobacco. But it's like, yeah, that is what runs through Western history. At least European history, and at least modern European history, when we started importing in large number, sugar, like table sugar, like just the chemical readily available form that you just, spread over your meal. That doesn't occur in nature. Like sugar in that refined form does not occur in nature. So to say that, yes, sugar is something that we have refined, imported from... I don't actually know where sugar is made, but it's not made in mainland Europe. It's imported from somewhere else. Yeah, I think that's an accurate assessment. So I don't want to get too much into I've never noticed this before, but his middle name is apparently Kemp, which is great. Hemp, right? Yeah, so why does coffee have a mood altering effect? Is it a central stimulant? Is that because? Because a lot of central nervous system stimulants have mood effects. Why does heightened activation of the nervous system indicate an increase in mood? Is it just the increase of neurotransmitters? And if that's the case, wouldn't an increase in... Yeah, because it indicates a flow state. Like, the only time you're that activated naturally is because you're engaged in something really challenging and really masterful, and you just have full flow of the nervous system. You're like, yeah, I'm engaged, I'm mastering, yeah. So that makes sense that it would be an increase in dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin, secondary neurotransmitters. That could be one explanatory model. So yeah, I mean, what does it... Okay, assuming we are dependent on caffeine as a drug, or on coffee, the bean in itself. Is that bad? Well, humanity have always co-evolved with plants, right? So we've always co-evolved with mushrooms or with food. I mean, plants are food, right? So obviously we've co-evolved with food. Whatever food was available, we've eaten. And some foods have become canonical in some cultures. Like, look at Japan with their, or Korea with their kimchi, and their seagrass, and their green tea, and and the sushi, and a whole different palette of cuisine than the West has, than England has, than the French has, than Spain has, with their, ham and... There's different cuisines to every culture, and every culture apparently develops within... Cultures are defined to a certain extent by the food they eat, not just the norms that they hold. And the nutritional rituals, like having dinner and having a large family dinner, especially in Italy, for example, they're part of what constitutes a culture. So, assuming we are addicted to caffeine, or at least contingent on coffee, is that bad? Well, this is anecdotal, but Norway is the most caffeinated country per capita. Like, we drink the most coffee per citizen in the world. I don't know if that's related to the extent to which we're able to adequately run our society. You can say, Norway is successful due to oil, but it's like, a lot of countries have oil. Venezuela has oil, the Arab Peninsula has oil. They're not Norway. There's something else than just happen to find natural resources. Is it coffee? No. But is there a correlation between caffeine consumption and productivity? I don't know. These would be very interesting studies to review. So if Norway was deprived of their caffeine, would we still function? Well, we'd have some massive hangovers, or hangovers, headaches, etc., withdrawal symptoms. What if coffee disappeared from the planet? It's an interesting question. What if there was no more coffee? Yeah, what would the West... Forget Norway. What would the West look like without coffee? Without cafes, coffee shops, the morning ritual of coffee. It's a canonical drug in our society. It's not mandated, but it's even provided. It's the only drug that's provided at every place of work. Like, you could never find marijuana or heroin just lying on your place of work, waiting for you. It's like, oh, you want your cup of heroin? Right? But yeah, sure, cup of coffee. Have at it. You're weird if you don't have it. And I um I think we're asleep to the effects coffee is having culturally and individually. Now, I love coffee. My best ideas come from coffee, but I'm not numb to the extent to which it affects our society, our culture, our workplaces. Coffee has this sort of like spike and then decline. And morning coffee is great, but then at 12, maybe you need some more, or maybe you need some more, or maybe you need some more. It has this sort of low key inflammatory effect in the background that sort of makes you feel like, I've had coffee. So it's like a dual edged sword. It's big kick up, and then there's like a cumulative effect in the body. It's very interesting. I love coffee. So I might just call this video coffee because it's so. The whole thing is like encapsulated in there. So, going back to Camus. Should I kill myself or should I have a cup of coffee? Well, if you're at that level where only the stimulation from caffeine keeps you going, maybe there are other things you should review in your life. Is the West, with all its internal contradiction, held together by coffee? What would happen if coffee went away? Would you still be able to work? Would you still work? Would you work as hard? Would you feel motivated to work? All these questions. So, I guess that's it. Yeah, that's what I had to say about coffee. I hope you're having a good cup. I hope you enjoy your day. And, yeah, take care.